Hello, hello. I'm sorry you can't see me. For whatever reason, my camera has not been working nice with my OBS. Um, so I need to get that worked out. How's everybody doing? Oh, hello, person from Kickstarter. Hi. I'm actually teaching a class right now. You're welcome to sit in. I just wanted to let you know that this is one of my classes for the day job. But I'm very happy to have you. Yeah. Sorry, checking some stuff. All right. For my students, are there any questions about? I know we started you off on project 3 for the class, which is the retro game project. Are there any questions right now? I really hope this is students and not just new YouTube followers. Hello. Are any students here? Where are you all? Okay, what's going on? Okay, there's a student. Hi, student. Okay, so... Okay, cool. I even really just wanted to make sure that students were here. I got a bunch of new YouTube followers over the course of the Kickstarter campaign. So and they would get a not that they got alerts when I go live. So I just wanted to make sure that students were here too, so that as we talk about game design, it's hitting the ears who really need to hear it. So that you all get the benefit of the shenanigans I do. So I'm gonna get going. I actually have to. I really do need to end on time today because I'm getting my first dose of vaccine, and I'm pretty excited about it. So I got to make sure that I get my spot on time. But the thing that I'm kind of excited about today, one, because, we go through that middle period of not having any content. And that's, well, part of it was we had to do the presentations, and then we did have the guest talk, but we don't have lectures. So I don't get to interact with you all as much, at least in this way. We can talk on Discord and stuff, but so I'm happy to get back to the normal routine, but also just because I'm really into this topic, it's something that I'm really passionate about in terms of game development. So I like sharing this info. So today what we're going to talk about is art style and working from precedents. Well, what does that even mean? So today we're all about style, all about looking good. And we're also here to talk about art and what art is. And so here's the thing. The best game artists I know have lots of traditional art experience. Those skills are highlighted far less often than technical skills like rendering or proficiency with Photoshop or 3D art software. When you're a digital artist, the habit with digital art is that we judge it on use of the digital format and not necessarily on the soft skills that come with like composing an image or building a good color palette or things like that. And we've kind of gotten a culture where, I've actually encountered game artists that can't draw. They don't know how to use proper proportions or other hallmarks of traditional art, and that can lead to huge problems. For example, like I've actually had people come and say, "Hey, that's not obviously that's not a caricature of me, but these are my like little GDC talk characters from a few years ago." But I've seen people like in the wild say like, "Hey, come look at my work," and then the artist comes and looks at the work, and it's like, "Hey, I've made a character," and then you see the character and the proportions are all way off, and really terrible, and it's kind of like it breaks all the things you're supposed to do to make your stuff look good. Like maybe it is very proficient in the technical aspects, but totally loses, and not in like a purposeful way. I should there are a lot of drawing styles that are deformed in a very purposeful way, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just kind of like kind of like ignorant art, art without really an aim, just kind of like slapped together, and then it just looks bad. So one problem that our field is one problem that leads to this is that our field de-emphasizes game making disciplines descended from the arts in favor of others. So here on the left we have like the technical aspects, or we have often serious games, it's sort of like the sociological aspects of game making. And I'm not saying those are bad things. I'm just saying that that's what a lot of people focus on, and we lose out on really studying the music of games, studying the music of games, studying the theatricality of games, studying the artistry of games. And that's something that we really need to bring back. We need to really focus on. And even though the assets of games, arts, music, level design, and so on have clear influences from the broader landscape of arts, a lot of that gets lost because we focus too much on the interactivity or the computing power that goes into graphic or audio fidelity. So one thing that I see in game academia, for example, is like a lot of people write about the interactivity of games. And, we really fail to see how, something like, for example, Koichi Sugiyama's, and he's not a great person, but, he makes really lovely music for Dragon Quest, how he was greatly influenced by Bach, to the point where I was playing Dragon Quest 3 on my Game Boy one time, and my wife walked by and was like, "Why is Bach coming out of your Game Boy?" And I'm like, "Haha, it's Koichi Sugiyama, who is influenced by Bach." But we don't focus on that stuff. We focus on just like how do I music with software. So the problem is kind of a translation issue. We conflate skill with programs with artistic knowledge when it could be part of the case, but it's simply not the whole case. Software is a tool. It's not. It's a means to an end. It's not the end. I've heard people say like, "Well, I know the Unreal editor. I'm a level designer," and then I start to grill them on level design principles, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, "Wayfinding and approaches are very important," and they're like, "I guess," but it can be very. This is a common problem in the game industry. So like there's a bias towards software uses in technical art pipelines and away from studying fine art principles. So when a game artist doesn't know art, bad things can happen. And so what this talk is about breaking this pattern and talking about games, game art as art. So the question really becomes, now I'm not about to get into the are games art discussion. I think that's kind of a dead discussion, because like games are art, and I'm going to treat them as such. I'm just going to be like games are art. And I'm even going to be like game art is art, for the sake of argument's sake, because we've been at this for over 10 years, and like at this point we're 10 years past the time when the Supreme Court even ruled that games are art. But so I'm not going to get into that discussion, because it's more or less already been decided. What we should talk about, though, and I think that would actually be a fruitful discussion, is like, okay, well, so we've reached a point where games are art, great, and game art is art. So what kind of art is it? That's what we need to figure out. And the problem that I see when people talk about games and art is they don't really understand what that means. A lot of people will be like, I want games to be considered art. Okay. What does that even mean? Well, for one, it means that, games might have a lofty, respected role. And that's what most people think of when they think like, oh, games should be art. It's that they should be kind of like lauded as contributions to society. Okay, cool. But the way art works is that you also subject it to a curatorial process, meaning that it is subject to critique. And that critique is not bad. Most people think that critique is judgment, and often negative judgment, and it's not. What it means is that it's the way people talk about art is that they look at it, they compare it to other works of art, they talk about its elements. This is called appreciation. So this is what we want to do. We want to get into the part where we can kind of like learn to dissect games and their visual and audio and their artistic elements, and those elements that are linked to the fine arts, and learn to appreciate them in the way one would appreciate, a painting in a museum. So what are our takeaways today? Well, our takeaways is that we're trying to contextualize game art as art, and we want to find historical precedents for the work we're doing. So I'm going to provide a art history perspective on game art. I'm going to give an overview of possible trends in indie game art. Finding opportunities for reaching artists with existing skills. That's something I want to talk about. I want to talk about benefits of traditional media knowledge in game analysis and design, and I want to have an open conversation on art production methods. So the first part is genre. So let's talk about genre. Genre is a grouping of media based on form, medium, subject matter, or other organizing criteria. So what does this mean? So when we go see movies, remember seeing movies? When we watch movies on, I almost said Netflix, but when we stream pandemic movies, we think of genres like in when we look at film, we look at genre to mean like the type of information the piece is transmitting. Is it a documentary? Is it a superhero movie, action movie? Is it a rom-com? Is it an animated movie? And these are like broad overgeneralizations, but this is one mere PowerPoint slide in a larger lecture. So the idea stands like, we group movies and understand movies and books and literature in terms of like their topics. And we call that topic genre. In games, we think about the format of the game, 2D, 3D, first person, or the game mechanics, platformer, adventure, role-playing, shooter, and that likewise forms our understanding of game genre. But genre, as a concept, actually is much older. It comes from the art academies of, between the 17th and 19th century, which was called the academic art period in France. And genre meant that paintings were strictly organized not by style, but by topic. And paintings had strict rules for how you could create art in each genre. Now, we're not going to go over all of them. It's not useful for you to know all of them. What is useful for you to know is that the genres basically meant that, like, you could only paint certain scenes with certain materials. Okay? So, and we're going to look at two in particular. One of them is history painting, which is when you would paint a religious, historic, or allegorical scene or a mythological scene. And we're going to look at genre painting. So, let's make it even more confusing. Let's call one of the genres genre. But genre painting are scenes of everyday life. So a history painting, and here is, the last day of Pompeii, and it's a history painting. And so it's a religious, historic, or allegorical scene. And this is where, if you go to an art museum and you see an absolutely massive oil painting on an absolutely massive canvas, this is what you're looking at. You're looking at, often, according to the old rules, you would be looking at a history painting. Now, sometimes you will go to such a museum and you will see an absolutely massive oil painting on canvas, and it'll be of like a landscape or normal life or some other scene. So what's up with that? That breaks the rules. Yes, it does. That's the point. Because at one point, this artist, Gustave Courbet, got really annoyed with this. And he challenged this tradition by painting the funeral of his commoner uncle on a canvas that was 24 feet wide and 10 feet tall. And like this, monocles fell into champagne glasses, pearls were clutched, and this great offense to the rules of art introduced a new style of painting called realism, a new movement that celebrated common events with realistically rendered artworks. So they're basically applying the rules of genre painting to everyday life. And that's a big deal. That's a really big deal, because what happens is, if we look at this chart, if we look at this timeline of art styles, notice how if every colored line is an art style and every dot on the line is a century, look at how closely packed and how few art styles there were per century until the 19th century, when stuff starts taking off. And as soon as you get romanticism and realism, you start getting new art styles like bam, 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 really quickly. I'm working right now in, for example, Art Nouveau, which is the first line in the 20th century. And, so art styles kind of like proliferated really quickly once somebody got really annoyed and thought and decided to call shenanigans on the entire premise of this sort of like protected genre system. So, you're probably wondering, what does all this have to do with video games? Well, in modern popular games, it's common to depict scenes of epic setting or scale. Big industry commercial games, AAA games, utilize like exhilaration as a means to elicit the idea of fun or empowerment. In many ways, these are like history paintings, highly valued in the Academy art movement. When we see scenes like, and I love this game, I love the new Doom games so much. They are some of my favorite games of the last, oh my god, Doom 2016 is 5 years old. they're some of my favorite games of the last 5 years. But this scene is actually quite literally indicative. Like, it calls to mind Renaissance scenery in a very direct way. And, if we go back a little bit farther back at this point, here's some concept art for Destiny. Again, you have this sort of big epic landscape, and epic things happening in the epic landscape. Even further back, God of War, the original God of War trilogy. This is from God of War 3. And, I mean, what would you do in that? If we're talking about going straight back to mythology, you would fight gods, right? So all the concept art was of these really impressive, gods versus Kratos. And that was because they were trying to show off like the power of the console that the game was on. But, these are almost nearly one-to-one the kind of things that you would see within a genre painting system. In a history painting, is you'd see these kinds of scenes. And that's a really important thing to think about when we think about game art, because this is sort of like the dominant establishment style. As it stands, we also, we see kind of like an academy in terms of how artists get quote unquote into the industry. So, and as an educator, I can observe the reactions of students, you all. I love it when they do these kinds of things to give a kind of different scope to things. What do you mean? Do you mean like when they do sort of like this composition to kind of like create different scales, like little Kratos, giant Poseidon? Is that what's going on with the comment? Ooh, okay, coffee's getting cold. Blech. Okay, I'm going to keep moving on, but yeah, we can continue talking about this. So we have kind of this like academy of into the industry. Okay, I like what the setting is going to be for Doom Eternal. It's like you against it. Oh, okay. So yeah, kind of like when they do these paintings of you against the world sort of thing. But again, like it makes it seem epic. And like I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that like, isn't it kind of interesting that then has to become the aspirational style that... Let's put it this way. Okay, here's what I'm trying to get at. Besides, like, so yes, this art is cool. That's not what I'm getting at, though. Let me rein in the conversation here. This art is cool. Yes, we agree. However, and I always like try to find like what's my hook to talk with you all about this. So here's my hook. As people who are, you're like juniors or seniors, how do you feel about getting into the industry? How does that make you feel? Do you feel like it's possible? Do you feel like you're facing an uphill battle? Do you feel like you have to conform to a style like this? Or do you feel like you have freedom? I'm interested in... Really, that's what this lecture is about. It's about the sort of like what you're told to be versus what you actually have the freedom to do. And like, what's your perception of this as students graduating within the next few years? That's what I want to know. Anybody? Okay, so somebody says the type of art we're seeing here can set potentially a different standard that one might be in the game. Potentially, yeah. But like, I guess, and again, I'm talking to my students in particular. Um, like, how do you feel? How does this type of stuff make you feel? And again, not as gamers, as people who will be professionals in the field in a short period of time. Do you feel like, oh man, I can never do this? Do you feel like you merely have more to practice? Do you feel like, does it make you feel hopeful, hopeless? You know, well, I'm going to keep going a little bit, but I want you to think about that and answer in the chat. So we have this kind of academy, essentially. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that there is, for me, it seems a little daunting, but if I put forward the work, I should be fine. Awesome. For art, it gives me a goal to go towards, if I head towards, yeah. So, okay. And that's good. Like I've met students that feel like, this level might be beyond them, or the call to action of that is really daunting. I feel intimidated. It can be intimidating. Well, first of all, and the reason I wanted to open up this discussion is that I want you to understand this is normal. I want you to understand that I mean, and I teach the capstone course every year. The students, it's kind of hitting them like, oh my gosh, this is coming up, and what am I going to do? And that's okay. I've had lots of students do that, and then maybe they don't get a game job. They're working at it, but they don't get like a wholly, like game specific job until even like years after they're out of school, but they're still chipping away at it in some other way. I had a student just get a job at Amazon Game Studios very recently, and he thought he had given up, but now he's like having the time of his life. So it's not a right away thing, but it is a thing you can do. I want you to I want you to understand that. And yeah, it's healthy to understand that where you are right now, it's not that school is necessarily the way that you're going to get that job. School sets you up hopefully with a set of habits and knowledge to give you the ability to set out and continue that journey of learning and growing and practicing. But the industry can it can feel that like this exclusive academy that we have to impress, and one of the things that actually I think is very problematic about how the studio system is set up is that if we have 500 some schools in the United States alone, putting out graduates, there are not enough jobs in those few big studios for people. So what do? You either have to somehow become the very best at what you do, or we need to start thinking of other ways for people to engage this industry. So I know what you may be thinking. Okay, cool. But, and that's a neat thing about like those sort of popular industry styles. But like, what about all these other styles like pixel art? Well, and that's kind of what I want to get at. And this is where this gets into an art style discussion. So there's this paper that I like a lot. It's a few years old at this point. It's like 6 years old at this 7 years old at this point. But it's for the Digital Games Research Association conference by Jesper Juul. The paper is by Jesper Juul. It's called High Tech, Low Tech Authenticity: The Creation of Independent Style at the Independent Games Festival. So what Juul does, which I think is really neat, is he explores the art history of winning games at the IGF, and finds some trends. That's why you shouldn't just look at AAA, because not all games are art heavy and have amazing graphics. For me, it's mostly, man, I tell you what my favorite thing about teaching, not my single favorite thing, but one of the cool things. So I've been teaching games for 11 years now, and like, man, you all are so like indie savvy now. I'm so happy. Like, everybody's like, yeah, no, there's all kinds of art styles. Like, 5 years ago, everybody was like, indie games, what? In terms of art styles. But now everybody's just kind of like, yeah, of course there are. Thank you. That's great. I love it. But Juul does something kind of interesting. He looks at this as a series of art trends, and what he points out is that, like, before 2004, what you get is a lot of games that resemble what's in the AAA space, because the indie games were really just like tryouts for the AAA space. They were all trying to get jobs as AAA, and then something happens in 2004 that changes all of it. Do any of you know what big event happened in the game industry? And I'll give you a hint. It was a new platform launching. Do you know what that platform was that changed everything? You probably have it. It's probably on your computer. I know it's one of the first things I download when I get a new computer, because my library of games on it is so massive at this point. And heaven help us all if it ever shuts down. Steam. It's Steam. Yeah, Steam came out in like 2004, and it allowed indie developers to just release their own products without having to go through a publisher and get it in a physical store. And what that did is it allowed developers to not have to play by Walmart's rules. And that's hugely empowering. So what you start getting is start getting things, so here again you see visual style, 3D isometric, 3D, monochrome 2D with physics, platonic low poly 3D, hand-drawn 2D, pixel style, grayscape, and mostly pixel style, grayscale. So, suddenly we see these things changing very quickly, where, again, compare that to our old, timeline, where it was just like a few styles a century that weren't really all that different from one another, and then all of a sudden this one thing changes, and then it's like suddenly bam, 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 super fast. So you have 3D for 5 years, and then suddenly it's you know, 2005 had a different style than 2006, then a different style than 2008. So you got 2 years of hand drawn. Pixel art stuck around for a little while. Still is. And that's not to say pixel art's bad. I love pixel art. I'm doing a pixel art game besides my big game right now, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. But, and then Yule does something kind of interesting. He furthers that comparison by observing the transition from AAA 3D games to retro pixel art. He contends that pixel art has become for many designers a sort of return to the roots of video game graphics, an effort to recreate the authenticity of games, of the games medium, similar to, and again, and I think this is useful, and it may not be like practically useful to you necessarily, but I love it because I'm an art history nerd / actual scholar. But it's very interesting to me to find that those ties between what we do with game art and the like art history of fine art. So in the 19th century, there was something called the arts and crafts movement, and one of the lead members of that movement was William Morris, who was a printer. And what the arts and crafts movement was about was rebelling against automation, the Industrial Revolution and automated produced art, by going back to older ways, by making art by hand. And that's kind of what some pixel art's about. Now, I mean, there's certainly practical concerns. If you are a small team, you have a better chance of finishing your pixel art game than you do your photorealistic 3D game. And by that, I mean kind of any. But, so that's a consideration. But it also has this actual, like, that mindset has a precedent in the fine arts. And I think that's really cool. So pixel art has advantages. It can be accomplished in a very short period of time. Here's a screenshot of my Global Game Jam 2014 game. And I was able to make all the pixel art for this, all these environment tiles and these characters in a really short period of time. And I still think they look pretty good. I'm kind of bummed that this game never came to fruition, but I guess Nemo has elements of it. So it has a lot lower barrier to entry for people that are not, artists. So a game, art like pixel art, and this isn't to like, talk exclusively about pixel art, but, art like pixel art is important because, it's these other art styles are important because they allow us to make not only diverse looking games, it's more accessible to people. It's more accessible certainly than what one would consider the AAA style, the AAA Academy style, and that's good. That's a good thing. That makes game making more accessible, and frankly, it gives you more career paths. I'll even say it career paths because you can become a professional pixel artist. There are lots of instances of people doing professional pixel art for high visibility games, because they were modders or in the pixel art community with indies or something like that. So you can do this and actually have that be a way to support yourself. The downsides of pixel art are that, while it was once the sign of being unique, it's now everywhere. And it's not much different from how games look decades ago. In some ways, it's just become... So, and this isn't necessarily a pixel art lecture, but I do want to say, like, hey, also be careful with this style because, games, you do run the risk of being samey. Or you can. So, also just be careful. Don't default to it either. So it's not that we need to change pixel art or any of these other art styles. It's that we need to change ourselves and get ourselves out of the mindset that graphical horsepower and photorealism equals quality, but we also need to get out of the mindset of just going with whatever, like a small limited amount of art styles. So I don't have a slide for it, but one of the so this is, by the way, from a Twitter thing that I think all of you should follow, called Bleepy Gamer Takes. It's really funny. I like it a lot. But one of the things that I do want to point out is that so I see this happen a lot when people discuss games with unique art styles, which is that you'll sometimes see folks use very limited language to talk about how games look. And I'll give you an example. So if somebody sees let me ask you all this, because I've talked a lot. If you were to see a game like Hollow Knight, and if you've never seen Hollow Knight, Google Hollow Knight screenshot and you'll get it. What would you call that game style, that art style? So, and this isn't a quiz. I just want to get perspective. This isn't like, like, what would you personally call a style like Hollow Knight's? Sort of like a comic book, okay? It's actually a very good answer. Chibi Goth, see that, yo. Your answers are too good, man. So yeah, I love those answers actually, because, so it's sort of like a comic book. Okay, good. You're comparing it to other media. Chibi Gothic. Now you're actually using art terms. Like, calling something Gothic actually is like, yes. And chibi, like, yes, that you're approaching it in the right way. I have listened to game podcasts with professional games journalists who, if it has crisp, clean lines, no matter what it is, they will say, oh yeah, it looks kind of like Flash. No. Because it's like, if it looks old school, it's pixel art. If it looks new, it's blah blah blah. If it's clean, it's because they're only working within the framework of games. That's a problem. Because, again, if we look at this like crappy gamer take, all they see is like, oh man, it's lazy. No, somebody decided that Animal Crossing should look the way it does. So I like what I'm sorry. There's that delay, so I'm not sure what you're saying. Like what to? What about like Flash? Sorry, I'm confused because there's a delay in like when you actually see. I'm actually like flash games, or flash animation. So like if you were to go to Newgrounds and play, gosh, I don't know. I want to say Alien Hominid, but Alien Hominid actually has really good like hand-drawn style animation. No. Yeah, so they say it looks like Flash, and they're kind of lumping Flash as like mid-2000s vector art. And yeah, I guess like kind of regardless of the actual like quality of animation, because like I said, the thing that pops into my head that's a Flash game is like Alien Hominid, which is like one of the games by the development studio that made Castle Crashers. And actually Castle Crashers might be a good example. So they might say like it looks like Flash, and a really good example of that would be like Castle Crashers. Now Flash might actually have other hallmarks. I was playing a game called Monster Boy. That was a few months ago. I got to get back to it. It's a good game. It's based on the old Wonder Boy series, but yeah, it looks like Flash, and I say that to mean like stuff moves in a very puppet way that I don't like. That face in Animal Crossing, yeah, reminds me of a me character. Okay. So especially as developers, we should find ways to not only change our attitudes, but also use those changes to invent connections between games and the arts. And why do you do this? Like, why care? Well, for one, and here's a good example, this is art from Cuphead. This is background art from Cuphead, and a lot of what made Cuphead special was just how unique and interesting that was. And part of that unique interestingness came from the fact that they were doing everything more or less old school. And that really made something cool. So Hollow Knight seems like characters and scenery have different art styles. Yeah, well, I mean, I would contend everything... I would contend that everything is of the same style, but they are different settings. Don't confuse like style and setting. So, real quick, I also want to talk. So how do we think about this? How do we do this? How do we break games into their component parts? Because it's one thing to actually say like Cuphead has really interesting art, but we could also then take Cuphead apart and look at this and be like, wow, now I get to appreciate each piece of Cuphead. And that's kind of cool. So what's up with that? How do we do that? So let's talk about theories of game analysis. So a lot of people do this. They look at a game as a piece of art. This is what art museums do. This is what academics do. This is what most people that talk about games do. Single work theory. It's an approach to studying games that considers them as single, self-contained objects. And this has precedent. It has precedent in film. In terms of production, single work theory works a lot like what they call auteur theory in film, where the director is considered the film's author. In games, this is where you get a dominant game designer. This is where you get stuff like this. The joke from... This is kind of a dated reference at this point, but the joke from like maybe a year and a half ago about a Hideo... What it means when something is a Hideo Kojima game. So this idea has been the subject of some ridicule in games, because I think gamers are fairly good at understanding that games are made by lots of people. You've also heard me say this before, but this is where my skepticism... If you've taken my games as Games for Education course, you will be familiar with this rant of mine, where I'm skeptical of games as a sort of magic wand. And what this means is, if you haven't taken that course, in the Games for Education course, we study a subset of games called, quote-unquote, serious games. And what serious games are is they are games made for addressing some real-world issue, whether that be it's like a training simulation, or it's for education, or it's an advocacy game, it's a game that is an activism game, something like that. So that can be, that's a really, it's a great genre it's a great type of game development. I've worked in it for a number of years. It's a great opportunity to get jobs in the game industry, is to get into serious games, or transformational games as we might call them. You don't have to move to a coast to do it. There are even studios that do this in Ohio. But that's not the point. The point that I'm making is that there is also movement in that serious games field that treats games as a sort of magic wand. Like, we're going to make a game, and the game is going to be about math, and then kids are going to learn math. Whoa! And they kind of see games as this magic wand of interactivity, and that's not really the case. And I'm not going to go too much into this rant, because otherwise it'll take the rest of the class, and I don't want to do that. But just understand that what allows us as game developers to take the elements of games and turn them into these subtle systems of messaging and education, is that we not only focus on the game itself as the thing teaching you, but the parts of game as sort of contributing to the message. What we talked about with like meaningful play earlier in the semester. And this is what I like to get into. I like to get into something called collected work theory, which is an approach to studying games or analyzing games that considers them as collections of artworks that work together to form an experience. So let's look at a cool game that I like a lot. So in Horizon Zero Dawn. So Horizon Zero Dawn is a great game. That is a thing most people can agree on. It's a really good game. But it is not its own like self-contained piece of art. Aloy as a character, both as a asset, as a model, is really cool, right? Like, and as a piece of writing, as an authored character with a story, the character is really cool. So we could just consider the character herself as a piece of art. The level design of this game is masterful. And, we can look at the level design of the game and analyze it as its own piece of art. Likewise, another thing that really makes this work is that the voiceover artists, who are artists, are likewise doing their own form of art, acting, to create this experience. So the game really becomes this experience made of like a bunch of smaller pieces of art working together into this as this network that produces meaning and emotion and feeling, right? And that's what collected work theory is about looking at the elements of games and understanding how they contribute to an overall message, or an overall mood or expression. And that's why it's important to look at something like a game according to these pieces. And this is why art style is so important when we work with art style. Because let's get back to the practicality of what you're doing, especially as associated with your project. It's an art direction project. How do we use art direction? How do we focus on the art direction as art, as its own unique effort that contributes to the quality of the game? So we can see how, again, these elements of games come from worlds beyond games. So, hi, Dad, I'm proud of you, son. Then we can make games influenced by works beyond just other games and pop media. It's important to not just be influenced by popular culture. We should just be influenced by culture. So then one of the last big things here is this idea of precedent. In design school, so precedent is studying previous work of art to inform your own. We were taught that precedent. So you're searching for previous work to help you guide your own designs. Basically, if somebody solved a problem similar to the one you have, a problem of, in my case, it was like, is there something going on with the site or the construction or the style or so on? You research that previous work and see how you might proceed. We don't just, so what I'm trying to get you to do, and I realize that I'm shooting myself in the foot in this effort a little bit with this project's design, because I'm actually giving you other games to be influenced by. But a call to action that I'd like you to think about is, don't just use other games as influences for your games, even if you are making a retro game. Look at works outside of games. So here we have Tadao Ando, which is a great influence on the game. Manifold Garden by William Chair. And if you go play Manifold Garden, if you liked Portal, you'll love this game. Or at least I do, and I love both those games. But it's the type of thing that, the aesthetic can... this gives you an idea, like a target aesthetic for something like this, and starts to inform how you assemble your game world and things like that. So again, what does this have to do with your project, where I'm literally asking you to be influenced by other games? So you're studying the graphic limitations of a bygone console and the types of games that were popular on the console in order to come up with a set of design criteria for your own work. So here's where this does become an art project, because I want you to mimic the technical aspects of the console, sure, but what the lessons involved is that you need to look at the historical context to really master this. You should look at the historical context of the console. So Specky Team, I'm calling on you. I always call on the Specky Team, and this is a screenshot from one of the previous Specky Teams. That's the ZX Spectrum, for those who don't call it the Specky yet. But, to understand the ZX Spectrum, you really have to understand the idea of the British computer culture in the 1980s. It was based on microcomputers. The microcomputers were kits that you would order in the mail for the cheaper model. You could buy it assembled, but a lot of people also got the kit. There were magazines where, you would sell games on discs, but a lot of games were also distributed via magazine that would just have like the code written out, and you'd type in the code and then the game would run. So there's this like hacker culture that goes along in this. There's also, some people speculate about different substances, and I'm not going to get into that that people were doing, but I'll go on the what is in the book Replay by Tristan Donovan, where he says, you have to understand a lot of these people were also people that like grew up and were watching Monty Python. So that kind of like absurdity, that absurd humor, would find its way into the games, and that goes a lot beyond like, oh, the ZX Spectrum can have this pixel dimension by that pixel dimension and display these colors. That gets into like who these people were that were making Specky games, and that's really important, because now we can start seeing like, well, what kind of stories did they tell? What kind of music did they have? What kind of imagery did you find? If you look at Specky games, like, you will find actually very close one-to-one recreations of scenes from Monty Python. In one game, Jet Set Willy, when you died, a giant foot would come down and squash you. And again, like, that is a direct call out to Monty Python's Flying Circus. So, not only are you doing the platform analysis, the technical platform analysis, you're also doing like some cultural study and trend analysis and things like that. So you're trying to learn like why the NES was the way it was, or why I believe the groups I have in this class are Specky and Neo Geo Pocket Color. Which in that case, well, actually the Neo Geo, they just released a collection of Neo Geo Pocket Color games on the Switch. But, look at, like, that is a lot of Japanese arcade games ported down to the Pocket, the Neo Geo Pocket Color. So it's like you've got to look at those for reference and see, like, why is it that these games are this way? So you're doing a lot of cultural study, too. And according to the parameters I've set up for you, at some point you are going to learn things like game engines and pixel art, and I have lectures and demonstrations about those, which I'll be glad to put into the resources tab on Discord. So it's like the software really only just like supports these goals. They're not the goal. My goal is not for you to learn Sprite and Game Maker specifically, though they're good skills. You need to learn like what we call design thinking, which is synthesizing disparate bodies of knowledge into a signal product or solution. So you're taking all of these influences. You're taking the cultural influences of what was happening around these devices to make them the way they were, and you're boiling them down into a game. You're trying to make a game that comments or recreates or celebrates the aspects of an era, more so than just mechanically reproducing, a game. So I like to think about this when I think about design thinking. A professor of mine in college said that my favorite thing about being an architect is that if I'm doing, for example, a hospital, I get to learn about the doctors and what they do during their day and how to make their day easier. And that's really interesting to me because, again, this is that advocate for the player idea, where we are not just mechanically producing technology, we are making an experience for somebody, and that experience should contain cultural references and cultural call-outs, and it exists for people who live in culture. And that culture includes things like abstract art. It includes things like transcendentalism. So this is let me give you some context. This is a game I made called Liszewski's Revenge, which uses the art style of a early 20th century propaganda artist named L. Liszewski, to make an arcade game that is a lot like this game Yar's Revenge on the Atari. So I used materials like he would have used to create the artwork, and I tried to make a game that embodied his art's themes of isn't it interesting how these two forms interact in the artwork, and that creates meaning. So I made a game where the player, by moving and manipulating the game like you would as you play the game, you could take a screenshot at any time and it would become its own new piece of Russian constructivist art. So this is a game by Tracy Fullerton at the USC Game Lab, and it's based on Walden by Thoreau, and basically you play as Thoreau living on Walden, and you embody the messages and lifestyle of transcendentalism as you play the game. And this is done more in a more like AAA 3D style. So you can do literature. I made a game a few years ago that was based on Don Quixote, which is a famous novel, and I tried to embody not only the story events but the themes into how you would actually use the cards in the game. So by playing the game, you're actually appreciating and analyzing and reshaping the narrative of Don Quixote in different ways. The development of language. There's a game called Dialect. It's a role-playing game. And you are actually generating language and living the life of a language as you play the game. Or an old comic strip. Here's a game that I'm working on right now, Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends. It's that one that's on Kickstarter. And, by studying the art of this old comic, we are coming up with ways to subvert the comic, to comment on the comic, to make cool visuals with the comic, and we're treating each piece of game art, and I actually have written, at this point, a ton of essays on it. We're actually really deeply studying the production process of this noteworthy comics artist. Another one is by a friend of mine, Bob DeShooter. It's called Brukel. It's his family story and the story of his grandmother's house. And you play this game that is actually it's a way to honor his grandmother's memories of growing up in this house. So one of the things, that's how we can make meaningful and artistically relevant games, is we can start to break out from the idea of seeing the game as its own thing and start to see, what if we included recordings of this person as items in the game? What if we started to treat each game asset as a recreation of this artist's style or these panels of a comic strip? What if we treated, what if we made the environment to represent a real world environment that was the subject of this book? And we're going beyond just considering the game as a whole, and now we're starting to talk about how the level becomes art, how the assets become art, how we include sound as art, and that's a much more full and rich experience than just surface level mechanics telling you not to drink or something like that, right? So it's not about technical skill. It's about synthesis of artistic forms wrapped in a package we call games. We set artistic goals first. When we make a game about the development of language or if you made a game like that RPG about the development of language, you work backwards to determine the best set of tools or materials that help you accomplish your goals. The thing that makes games come... the things that make games, so the art, the music, the architecture of games, they come from rich and storied histories, so it's important to learn how to incorporate them into our works. Any questions? I know that particular lecture gets very high concept, so I want to make sure that we can have a discussion about, again, what does it mean to again, you're being asked to explore and think about the visual style of a device, but maybe also that device's cultural impact. I will let you go after 2 questions. What's my favorite indie game? Oh, that's hard. I really like Hollow Knight a lot. I really like Hyperlight Drifter. Hyperlight Drifter has a lot of what I like in indie game in games in general. That's kind of hard. Man, that's hard. I really enjoyed. Oh, what's that one? Like the horror one. The horror one when you're at a camp. Of course, I'm going to get a lot of random camp, blah, 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 something. Indie game. Let's just search indie game and then see what happens. Yeah, it'll come to me. It'll come to me after class, probably. That was a great question, though. Stardew Valley is really fantastic. We play a lot of that in our house. Short Hike is really good. Oxenfree, that's the one I was thinking of. Oxenfree is really cool, too. But again, it's kind of a horror game. I don't know. One more question. Dead Cells, nice. One more question. Okay. Well, I actually have to run, so I will talk to you all later. But thank you for listening, and I will post some of the pixel art stuff on Discord tomorrow.